Welcome to class on this Wednesday. I know you guys are studying for your final next week, so here is just a little more information for you to hold on to. This is a slide representing ISIS, also known as ISIL, and of course this convoy is full of ISIS members and they have their flags waving. They're coming into some town, so I would be pretty terrified myself. I do want you to notice what ISIL stands for and ISIS. They can be referred to as either group. I know that President Obama always called them ISIL, and I kind of prefer that myself. ISIL stands for the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant, and then if you call it ISIS, which is actually more common, I guess, is the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria. I felt like that President Obama purposely called it the Levant, which just means more land, than Syria, to kind of take Syria out of the equation. So I also prefer that. This is how much land that actually ISIS was covering in Iraq and Syria at one point. So you can see they had a much of a stronghold, and it was pretty scary to think that they were all the way, almost all of Syria, and then a major part also of Iraq. So they did start crumbling, and this is a map from 2017. So you have the Islamic rebels in orange. You have the Islamic State and ISIS. These are in the dark gray. So still, out of this area that was all ISIS, you can now see that the dark gray is ISIS. And then you have different groups here. The Syrian government has taken over in the blue area, and the Turkish-backed Free Syrian Army, which is in yellow here. So there are different groups now that are being able to control parts of what had been the ISIS or ISIL caliphate. And then this is in just Syria, and this is in April 14th of 2018, and I got this from Al Jazeera, so I feel pretty good about this. This is just Syria, not including Iraq. The Syrian government forces are in red. So that's the government of Syria. ISIL is in black. You can see that ISIS or ISIL definitely much less land territory anyways that they're controlling in Syria. You have the Kurdish forces up here. The Americans tend to back the Kurdish people of Syria. You have rebel forces, which is just another different group but not the ISIS group, in the green. And then you have Turkish and other rebel forces up here. So Turkey on the border is definitely concerned about what happens to Syria next because there is a refugee crisis also. So this is a TED Talk about the surprising way that ISIS stays in power. It's not very long, and I want you to pay attention to like how are they getting the money, because you can usually follow the money whenever you have an organization and see how are they supporting themselves and how are they reinventing themselves and how are they keeping the control that they have.
For the past decade, I've been studying non-state armed groups. Armed organizations like terrorists, insurgents, or militias. I document what these groups do when they're not shooting. My goal is to better understand these violent actors and to study ways to encourage transition from violent engagement to non-violent confrontation. I work in the field, in the policy world, and in the library. Understanding non-state armed groups is key to solving most ongoing conflict, because war has changed. It used to be a contest between states. No longer. It is now a conflict between states and non-state actors. For example, of the 216 peace agreements signed between 1975 and 2011, 196 of them was between a state and a non-state actor. So we need to understand these groups. We need to either engage them or defeat them in any conflict resolution process that has to be successful. So how do we do that? We need to know what makes this organization tick. We know a lot about how they fight, why they fight, but no one looks at what they're doing when they're not fighting. Yet, armed struggle and unarmed politics are related. It is all part of the same organization. We cannot understand these groups let alone defeat them if we don't have the full picture. And armed groups today are complex organizations. Take the Lebanese Hezbollah, known for its violent confrontation against Israel. But since its creation in the early 1980s, Hezbollah has also set up a political party, a social service network, and a military apparatus. Similarly, the Palestinian Hamas, known for its suicide attacks against Israel, also runs the Gaza Strip since 2007. So these groups do way more than just shoot. They multitask. They set up complex communication machines, radio stations, TV channels, internet websites, and social media strategies. And up here, you have the ISIS magazine, printed in English and published to recruit. Armed groups also invest in complex fundraising, not looting, but setting up profitable businesses, for example, construction companies. Now, these activities are keys. They allow these groups to increase their strengths, increase their funds, to better recruit, and to build their brand. Armed groups also do something else. They build stronger bonds with the population by investing in social services. They build schools, they run hospitals, they set up vocational training programs or microloan programs. Hezbollah offers all of these services and more. Armed groups also seek to win the population over by offering something that the state is not providing: safety and security. The initial rise of the Taliban in war-torn Afghanistan, or even the beginning of the ascent of ISIS, can be understood also by looking at these groups' efforts to provide security. Now, unfortunately, in these cases, the provision of security comes at an unbearably high price for the population. But in general, providing social services fills a gap, a governance gap left by the government, and allow these groups to increase their strength and their power. For example, the 2006 electoral victory of the Palestinian Hamas cannot be understood without acknowledging the group's social work. Now, this is a really complex picture. Yet in the West, when we look at armed groups, we only think of the violent side. But that's not enough to understand this group's strength, strategy, or long-term vision. These groups are hybrid. They rise because they fill a gap left by the government, and they emerge to be both armed and political, engaging violent struggle and providing governance. And the more these organizations are complex and sophisticated, the less we can think of them as the opposite of a state. Now, how do you call a group like Hezbollah? They run part of a territory, they administer all their function, they pick up the garbage, they run the sewage system. Is this a state? Is it a rebel group? Or maybe something else, something different and new? And what about ISIS? The lines are blurred. We live in a world of states, non-states, and in between. And the more states are weak, like in the Middle East today, the more non-state actors step in and fill that gap. This matters for government, because to counter these groups, they will have to invest more in non-military tools. Filling that governance gap has to be at the center of any sustainable approach. This also matters very much for peacemaking and peace building. If we better understand armed groups, we will better know what incentives to offer to encourage the transition from violence to non-violence. So in this new contest between states and non-states, military power can win some battles, but it will not give us peace nor stability. To achieve these objectives, well, what we need is a long-term investment in filling that security gap, in filling that governance gap that allowed these groups to thrive in the first place. Thank you.
I can cut it from there.
And I'd also like you to see the Syrian refugees here. This is a very small clip of just the Syrians leaving an area of Syria. So as I've told you before, you can be a refugee within a country as well as outside of a country. So these people are being forced to move from their town because of actual fighting that's either happening currently or getting ready to happen. So there are thousands of civilians and rebels in the same area, and obviously civilians are trying to leave. And this is just one of the many pictures of the Syrian refugees. So this man is carrying a little girl from Syria, and he's arriving on a dinghy, so a very small boat, after crossing from Turkey at the coast and going into Greece. And this was September 9th, 2015. But this is the plight that some of the Syrian refugees find themselves in. And obviously Greece is one of the countries who have said, you know, we no longer can take refugees, so we have no more room. And then when the refugees from Syria arrive there, of course, they try to make their way northward, and then other countries are inundated also with refugees. So this crisis is a worldwide crisis, actually. And these are the 5 U.S. goals in Syria currently. These I found these as of 2018, actually under the Trump administration. So I'd just like you to think about the 5 goals, like why are we in Syria and what is it we're trying to accomplish. So we definitely want to defeat ISIS completely and Al-Qaeda, another terrorist group. We also want the United Nations to have a resolution for Syria that involves Assad's departure, so no longer having him be the leader. And then also to lessen Iran's power and control, to create conditions for the safe return of the refugees back to Syria, and then completely eliminating the chemical weapons that are found in Syria. So our Secretary of State, Tillerson, warns that Al-Qaeda is still a grave threat and is looking to reconstitute in new and powerful ways. So we in no way have won the war on terror, but we do continue to fight it in Syria and elsewhere. So he does think, our Secretary of State thinks that a total withdrawal of U.S. personnel would restore Assad to his complete control and continue his brutal treatment of his own people. And Assad has been accused of using biological and or chemical warfare on the Kurdish people of his own country. So this is something the United States is not in favor of. This is a terrorist group chart. I tried to find 2018 terrorist group, and honestly, I could not find one that had everything on it that I wanted. So as you can see, the marker up here, this would be the number of attacks. This is the age, which is how long has the organization been around. This is kind of the size of it, which I don't really know the quantifications of extra small, but at least you know they're small. And then the terrorist group name. So the ones I want you to see here obviously are ISIL, and notice that it's extra, extra large. It's in the Middle East, so that's one that we're dealing with right now. And also Al-Qaeda over here is global, and it's extra, extra large. So how long has Al-Qaeda been around? We are saying about 28 years. How long has ISIL been around? About 12 years. And so then you can look through this chart and see. You would have to look up the name because I know this is blurry, and actually I can't read it even on the first copy myself. So those are the 2 I wanted you to see, but don't think that that ISIS is it or ISIL is it. FARC is another one that's extra large, and it's in, I know, Central and South America, and so you can see that. So it just depends on what you're familiar with and what you're looking for, but every continent is represented here. Almost. We have global also, so I guess that means every continent's represented. So terrorism can happen anywhere. I just think that you need to be aware of ISIL and how defeated they actually are at the moment, and how we can finish that maybe in Syria. But of course, where does ISIL move next? Like, that's always the question. Because obviously with this group of terrorist organizations in the world today, this is not going to be over. So I want you guys to go on to the Canvas now. There is a worksheet about ISIL, and it's pretty straightforward, but it looks like this. I do want you to think about the dangers posed by the Islamic State group, and just fill that out for me and turn that in by the end of the period. Okay, tomorrow you guys are going to play Jeopardy, your first Jeopardy board game. And we have Jeopardy 1, 2, and 3. So Thursday is Jeopardy 1. Please study tonight all the way back to your World War II notes.